Welcome to OA Week, everybody. We will get started in just one moment as we let more participants trickle in. Thanks. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today for OA Week 2025. My name is Carly LaRoche, and I'm a member of the GOA-ON Secretariat. Sorry, my camera's being a little funky. Please note that this session is being recorded. OA Week is presented by 4 sponsoring organizations. First, GOA-ON, the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network. Second, NOAA, the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Third, the IAEA, the IAEA OAICC, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center. And let me just share my screen again. There we go. And last but not least, the IOC, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. GOA-ON was established in 2012 with just a handful of members. Since then, GOA-ON has grown immensely and now has over 1,200 members from over 110 countries. GOA-ON also consists of 11 regional hubs, which span across continents and oceanographic regions. We'll be hearing from most of them throughout OA Week. If you're not a member yet, you can join GOA-ON today by visiting goaon.org, and I'll drop that link into the chat in a moment. OA Week debuted in 2020 and returned in 2021 when events and conferences were postponed due to COVID-19. Following the successful in-person symposium on the ocean in a high CO2 world in 2022, OA Week has become an annual event to maintain momentum around OA research and provide a virtual platform for the ocean acidification community to exchange their latest findings. We are thrilled to present a wide range of ocean acidification topics and speakers from around the world throughout the week. A few notes on housekeeping before we get started. During the presentation, all participants are in listen-only mode. You are welcome to type any questions into the questions box, which can be found at the bottom of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be monitoring incoming questions and we'll pose them to our speakers during the question and answer periods, which will begin. We'll have a few of them scattered throughout the session. You can also use the raise hand function in the toolbox at the bottom of your screen, and we'll call on you to answer your question directly. And at this time, I'd like to introduce you to your moderator for this session, Dr. Anna Franco. Anna is an ocean biogeochemist with experience observing and modeling the marine carbon cycle in different time scales, from localized drivers of short-term extreme acidification events to impacts of interannual variability and long-term ocean acidification. More recently, she joined the Horizon Europe project, Rescue, where she focuses on the question, can our present-day ocean observatories detect future impacts or side effects of ocean alkalinity enhancement applications? Thank you for joining us today, Anna, and for putting together this exciting session on mCDR. And I'll turn it over to you.
Hello. Hi, Carly. Thank you so much for the intro. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the marine carbon dioxide removal session with a focus on the impacts and opportunities for ocean acidification. And Well, the motivation for this session is because in addition to strong and immediate carbon emission reductions, carbon dioxide removal strategies may become critical to avoid exceeding the temperature limits of the Paris Agreement. Continuous and consistent monitoring of the carbonate system is essential to detect the early emergence of any mCDR-related signals and any potential side effects, including potential amelioration of ocean acidification. In this session, we will hear from 5 researchers across the world working to advance our knowledge on the potential opportunities and biogeochemical impacts of marine CDR. The first 2 speakers will provide a 13-minute presentation. Then we'll have a chunk of minutes for questions, and we'll continue with 2 more speakers, questions for them, and finish with a group discussion, which will include the audience, hopefully, on early career recommendations for the mCDR sector. With this, I welcome everyone, and we can begin with our first speaker. First, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, which is Dr. Brendan Carter. He is a research oceanographer at NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, or PMEL, affiliated with the University of Washington Cooperative Institute for Climate, Ocean, and Ecosystem Studies. His work combines physical and chemical ocean observations with forward, inverse, and data assimilation modeling to understand how much carbon in the ocean is attributable to human emissions. Explores the ocean's capacity to buffer future CO2 inputs and monitors the biogeochemical consequences of ocean acidification. Thank you so much, Brendan, for being here. Now, the floor is yours.
All right, hopefully you're seeing my screen now and I'm now unmuted.
Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Anna. Most of my research here at the Cooperative Institute for Climate, Ocean Ecosystem Studies is surrounding the carbonate system in seawater, but today I've been asked to talk about some of the potential applications of marine carbon dioxide removal for ocean acidification mitigation. Specifically talking about some of the research that's going on up here in the Pacific Northwest. What I'm showing here is a big shotgun blast of the wonderful people that I've had the privilege of working with up here on many of these projects. And specifically, I'm going to be trying to briefly touch upon research that was published with the people with green borders as first authors. So this is a large swath of research that I'm going to be trying to touch on today. Okay, first up, I think most of you know, but what is marine carbon dioxide removal? It's ways to get the ocean to take up more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You might think, but wait, that's the reverse of ocean acidification mitigation, and you'd be right. However, the way that these techniques typically work is that they change the surface ocean seawater chemistry in a way that does initially mitigate ocean acidification pretty strongly, and then the atmosphere responds by putting more CO2 back into the ocean to get rid of a lot of that ocean acidification mitigation on longer timescales. I'll give you an example from my research, which is focused on electrochemical ocean alkalinity enhancement. And the way that works is you take seawater and use electrolysis or electrodialysis to split it into an acid stream and a base stream. The acid you then either neutralize or you use it in markets to displace other kind of carbon intensive acids. Then the base, you take that and you put it back into the seawater. When you do, there's 2 different reactions that happen on 2 different timescales. Very quickly, there's the base, which is represented by sodium hydroxide here, pulls a proton from a bicarbonate, and that elevates the amount of carbonate that's in seawater, which you can think of that as very rapid, less than a second mitigation of ocean acidification. Then on the timescale of weeks to months to years, the atmosphere responds by allowing more CO2 to go into the ocean, reacting with that carbonate and other molecules, and then that gets stored as bicarbonate. So it's important to recognize that throughout this process, initially the pH goes up pretty strongly, and by the end of the process, it's only up a little bit. But there's that window of time in which you've mitigated ocean acidification. And the summary of the rest of the research I'm going to show today is that, yes, we think we can use this to locally mitigate ocean acidification, but boy, would you have to scale up a whole lot from where we currently are to get to the point where you're having a meaningful impact. Okay, I'm going to briefly touch upon this. This is just some early research that we did during the kind of pandemic years, testing out one of these techniques. Laboratory research led by Mallory Ringham showed that the technique was working more or less as we would expect. The alkalinity went up, the PCO2 went down, the dissolved inorganic carbon did creep up, but it took a lot longer to do so. That's good. Hongji Wang was doing some modeling suggesting that if you were to implement this in the Unimac Pass in a very scaled up sense, you could mitigate ocean acidification over a broad region. Although even then, the amount of ocean acidification mitigation was pretty minimal. This is 1 microatmosphere of PCO2 over that kind of contour. So with that, these kind of first initial checks in place, it seemed like things were more or less working as intended. So at that point, the technology was sold to a new startup called EbCarbon. EbCarbon was looking to do a field trial, and we had some more questions that we thought we could test in association with something like that. And so we linked up with EbCarbon and also with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and they were willing to host this field trial, or at least kind of work towards that. This is kind of a map of the Pacific Northwest Orient U in space. This is the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Seattle's down here. This red box is encircling Squim Bay. This is what Squim Bay looks like. And then this is another red box encircling the mouth of Squim Bay, where you can see the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory Squim campus. This is what that campus looks like. And then in this building, EbCarbon was able to install one of their electrodialysis ocean alkalinity enhancement base generation systems. We then spent the next 2 years or so kind of doing prep work for this field trial, and that involved kind of building consensus towards with local communities. It involved making sure our permits were, all squared away, and also doing some modeling and some species response studies to make sure that we'd have a really good sense of what was going to happen if this field trial were to go ahead. The modeling was done with the finite volume community ocean model, FVCOM, implementation that is run by the Salish Sea Modeling Center, which is a collaboration between the University of Washington and the Pacific Northwest National Lab. The really neat thing about the FVCOM model is it allows you to have different model geometry in different locations. So we could have really high resolution modeling right where we wanted it at the point of release, kind of right there, while also still capturing a very large domain with coarser resolution kind of further afield. Did some initial testing of that upscaled grid right at the mouth of Squim Bay, and they found that it was accurately capturing the very strong tidal currents that kind of come into and out of that bay. Also did some biogeochemical validation. Then started doing some tests of what we would expect to happen if we were to do a large scale kind of discharge of alkalinity. And this is a summary slide of kind of a key punchline from that, which is that if we were to do what we had planned, kind of the small planned field trial release, you really wouldn't expect to see any noticeable, measurable, detectable impact on pH. So you can see all of this is kind of white. However, if we were to upscale by about a factor of 1,000, then you'd see some moderate ocean acidification mitigation across the bay a little bit. Notably, these dark blue colors represent a pH increase of about 0.11, which is almost exactly a reversal of the modern ocean acidification impact. So again, if we were to upscale pretty massively, then we might have some local scale impact on OA. This is a paper led by Trong Kengonkar. I'm throwing the QR codes up for people who want them. During that modeling exercise, there were also some meso and microcosm experiments going on, looking at the impacts of kind of elevated pH on the organisms in there. We're less interested in testing the co-benefits at this stage and more interested in looking at the potential harm that could happen right at the point of discharge of the high pH product. The pH that we would be releasing would be about 9, at least in this case. And so it would be between this purple line and this orange line in terms of the species responses. These plots are showing species mortality over time for sea hares and isopods. And you can see for the very concentrated product, the kind of purple and orange, there's a significantly elevated mortality of these animals. For isopods, it was only more pronounced than the kind of most concentrated values. But again, these would be very localized impacts. So like within a foot or two of the outfall pipe or less than a meter. as far as what would be expected to be broadly seen if we were to do 1,000 times the field trial that we had planned and then keep it up over a whole year, then we would expect a kind of broad scale impact of around this much elevation. So 0.11 relative to this much variability, which is what we were seeing in October of 2 years ago. By contrast, what we were really testing, the species mortality impacts were this kind of green, orange, and purple line. So very, very acute. With that in place, and with the kind of 2 years of permitting and community consensus building, we were able to move on to a field trial more recently, and Ali Savoy released this paper earlier this year. And this is just showing that, you know, as we would expect, when you release the base was being released during these blue bars, the pH crept up at the outfall sensor location. So pH crept up. And when we stopped, it very quickly relaxed back down to normal just due to rapid dilution. Similarly, about 70 meters away, we had sensors on this pier and we could detect no meaningful ocean acidification mitigation. So at least at the scale that we were attempting this, we would not expect to see widespread or prolonged ocean acidification mitigation. Okay, I've got a couple minutes left, so I wanted to talk briefly about this paper, which Mary Margaret Stoll just submitted, focused on detecting ocean acidification. It's kind of a lot to go into, and I suggest you check it out when it gets out of peer review. But the main morals that we found is that, generally speaking, ocean acidification mitigation can be detected from an mCDR field trial over very short timescales, so timescales of a couple days. And then if you were to have 10 years of monitoring before you started releasing base, and then 10 years of monitoring after you started releasing base, then you would start to be able to see detectable ocean acidification over a wider area. So there's this kind of unhappy medium valley of death here, where for a release of about 1 month, you actually really wouldn't expect to see it because there'd just be so much natural variations before or in between your 2 time points that you wouldn't really be able to pull or tease out the signal from your field trial. We also did some work showing that if you used empirical algorithms, feel free to ask me about this, but if you use empirical algorithms as a way to kind of estimate what the unperturbed signal would be, that you can kind of short circuit that valley of death and still get good detectability even during for a much shorter period of monitoring. Mary Margaret also had some really interesting analysis where she was asking the question, how much would we need to scale this up in order to have widespread ocean acidification mitigation? And I'm going to focus on this plot here for pH. Everywhere within this purple contour, we could detect an impact on pH if we were to scale up what we had planned to do. If we were to scale up what we had modeled by a factor of 10 to the 3. So that's about a factor of 1,000 larger. And for reference, the model simulation that we were using was already a factor of 1,000 larger than what we were actually doing with our field trial. So we would have to scale up our field trial by a factor of 1,000,000 before we would have widespread detectable pH impacts. Detection was very similar for PCO2 as pH. And then for DIC, it was even less detectable because that creeps in slowly. For alkalinity, it was more detectable because there's less natural variations. I finally wanted to conclude with a brief plug for this recent paper by Reese Barrett, which has only tangential relations to mCDR, but I think this community would find it really interesting, which is that if ocean acidification were indeed slowing down the formation of shells and hard parts by marine organisms out of alkaline minerals and decreasing the rate of transport of those minerals from the ocean surface into the ocean interior, then the last 20 years of global circulation models have told us that we would expect there to be an accumulation of alkalinity slowly over time in the ocean surface. Reese was looking at whether or not that can be seen in the last 30 years of repeat hydrography, GOA-ON and previous records. And what she found is that indeed, if you look in the surface ocean, you're seeing a rate of increase of alkalinity over time relative to expectations that you do not see in the ocean depths. So this is really suggestive that that fingerprint, that kind of smoking gun, that ocean acidification is reconfiguring how alkalinity moves around in the ocean. We're able to now start seeing that in kind of these repeated decadal measurements. And I think that's all of my time. So I wanted to thank you all for your attention and look forward to today's session and talks.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for this really interesting talk. A reminder to the audience that we will hold the questions until the end of the following speaker, which I'll introduce next. But in the meantime, you can already start typing your questions in the Q&A box if you wish so. Okay, our next speaker is Hendrik Goossen-Lindemann. Hendrik is a PhD student in climate sciences at the University of Bern and the Oeschger Center for Climate Change Research. His research is on modeling ocean carbon removal and sequestration with a focus on marine carbon cycle in the climate system and investigating possibilities to increase the ocean's carbon uptake to lower atmospheric CO2 concentrations. Hendrik studies climate sciences to enhance the society's knowledge on the impacts of human interaction with the climate system, and in particular to help tackle global warming. Thank you so much, Hendrik. You can start your presentation now.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here. Okay. Why is it not? I hope you can see everything well. And thanks again. And I want to briefly talk about my work I'm currently doing in my PhD together with Friedrich Burger and Thomas Fröhlicher here at the University of Bern. And, to highly idealized large-scale OAE and climate modeling, so the complete opposite of what Brendan just showed. And I mostly look into process understanding, and today I want to say a bit about the efficiency and also, of course, ocean acidification mitigation potential of OAE, and this on timescales of multiple centuries. So to do that, I'm looking at a fully coupled Earth system model and running this in emission-driven mode. So we have full interaction between carbon reservoirs in the ocean, atmosphere, and land. And then looking at a baseline scenario of temperature stabilization. And let me walk you through the simulation. So up here you see global surface air temperatures, anomalies, and the emission pathway, atmospheric CO2 concentration in the middle, and then the response and ocean surface pH. And shown here at first is the historical period. And now looking at the future scenario is a stabilization scenario that stabilizes at a certain target, and we set it to 2 degrees. So based on that, we get this emission pathway that leads us to this temperature stabilization, and at the same time leads to this temporal evolution of atmospheric CO2, where we see a continuation of an increase at first, where we still have positive emissions, and then this peaks and continuous ocean carbon uptake reduces this CO2 concentration over time. And mostly following this concentration in atmospheric CO2 is the ocean acidification, which continues to increase, but then also peaks and pH increases again over time, really following this trend, this change in atmospheric CO2. And now using this as our baseline simulation, we take the same emission pathway that would lead us to this stabilized warming, and now we do large-scale ocean alkalinity enhancement following the CDR protocol. So we do continuous addition of alkalinity at the surface ocean over this 500-year time span until 2500 to look at processes and especially carbon cycle feedbacks and how they impact the efficiency of OAE. And when we do this, we see a strong impact in the climate system. So continued ocean carbon uptake decreases atmospheric CO2 concentrations in the end by around 87 ppm. This leads to a cooling in the climate of around 1/4 degree at the end. And again, following this CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, surface pH also responds, and we see an increase in the pH at the end, also around 0.12. So as Brandon said, leading us back to near pre-industrial values. But actually to disentangle the impact of the alkalinity addition and the change in the ocean carbonate chemistry, as well as global carbon cycle feedbacks, we do a third set of simulations where we now run in concentration-driven mode and follow this reduced atmospheric CO2 concentration here, but don't do any alkalinity enhancement. So based on that, we get the same climate state as we are in the case with OAE, but no alkalinity addition, so not changing the ocean carbonate chemistry. And therefore, we can disentangle the effects of different climate state and natural carbon fluxes and the imposed fluxes due to alkalinity enhancement. And this then also has an impact onto the surface pH, but I will go into more detail about this later in the talk. I first want to start a bit about efficiencies of OAE over time. And the efficiency basically describes the amount of additional carbon uptake we get per alkalinity addition. And based on the carbonate chemistry in the ocean, we get a maximum efficiency, which explains how much DIC we take up until we fully equilibrate again back to the initial PCO2. So alkalinity lowers PCO2, we take up carbon, and this rises again. And until full equilibration, we will get an efficiency of around 0.8 to 0.85, which is the maximum we can achieve. When we now take a look at what the ocean is actually taking up, we see that this efficiency is way lower. So it's in the first century, it's rather stable, around 0.6, but then starts to decrease. And the decrease here occurs where atmospheric CO2 peaks. And this general difference here, as well as the temporal reduction, is mostly due to changes in or due to global carbon cycle feedbacks. So when the ocean takes up CO2 from the atmosphere, it reduces atmospheric CO2, which then lowers the gradient and allows for less carbon uptake into the ocean until we equilibrate again between the ocean and the atmosphere. But again, we can correct for this with this additional reference simulation. And when we take a look at that, so this is now the gross carbon uptake into the ocean. So the exact amount of carbon that is due to the alkalinity addition. We see that this efficiency is rather constant and pretty high and quite close to the maximum efficiency. So this then resembles negative emissions, where we see, okay, how much is the ocean actually taking up? And then feedbacks do their thing, but to relate this to carbon credits, we would need to take this green line and this gross capture efficiency. But when we want to look at what's happening in the climate system, we're interested in the change of atmospheric CO2 concentration, which is now the efficiency to reduce that in the red line. And this is even lower than the oceanic uptake because of a response of the land biosphere, which sort of buffers the reaction or the reduction in atmospheric CO2. But now focusing on the signal of ocean acidification, we see in our simulations that the impact of alkalinity enhancement really mirrors spatially the historical ocean acidification that we have seen. So in the left plot, the difference of current acidification levels to the pre-industrial levels, and in the right-hand side, the difference between OAE and the reference simulation. And we see that the general pattern is pretty much the same. So same processes act here, just in the opposite direction. And the same goes when we take a look at what happens in the water column. So here, Hofmöller plot of pH changes over depth. And we see in historical period this downward propagation of acidification. And we see the same signal here when we do large-scale alkalinity enhancement. So again, this is really just the opposite of historical processes. So this already hints that the same processes act with alkalinity enhancement here and with the application of the CDR approach. Taking a closer look at the change in the average surface pH. So this is the same plot as before, but extended a bit. I'll come to this in a minute. So shown here is the pH change from the alkalinity enhancement in the dashed line here, reference to the baseline simulation. And we see this increase in ocean acidification mitigation over time. However, when we take a look at this dotted line, which represents the same climate but without alkalinity enhancement, so not changing the carbonate chemistry, we see that over time this ratio here gets larger, and I can also quantify this. So looking at how much pH mitigation is coming actually from the alkalinity addition in ratio to the full response in pH, we see that this is quite strong, quite large at the start, but then reduces over time until we have values of just around 25% at the end of the alkalinity addition here, which basically says that 75% of the OA mitigation that we get just comes from reducing atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and thereby could be due to any CDR approach, marine CDR or terrestrial CDR. It doesn't matter, like reducing atmospheric CO2 leads to the largest reduction in ocean acidification here. And now when we, what we then did is in year 2500, we stopped alkalinity enhancement, so no further addition, and then looked at the climate system and how it responds. This impact here in the end gets even lower because more alkalinity that is already in the system has to equilibrate. So the reduction in PCO2 that is due to all this added alkalinity here has not yet fully equilibrated with the atmosphere. And when we do that, we increase PCO2 again, and thereby lowering the pH. So we see this total impact here at the end is really only on the order of 10 to 15%. And we can see the same metric here over the depth. So the same plot here, but as a Hofmüller plot over depth. So it might become a bit complicated, but it basically shows that we see this intensification of this OAE mitigation potential at depth as well. But we relate this to downwelling of alkalinity enriched waters that have not yet equilibrated again with the atmosphere back to the initial PCO2 levels. So we still have this DIC deficit here that leads to this large change in pH. But what we see also after termination is that this maximum then gets buffered in a sense. So of course we have mixing to deeper layers, but also again with the upper layers of the ocean. So these alkalinity enriched waters then lead to further carbon uptake at the surface when they get upward again to the surface, and thereby can explain some of this constant offset here that we see over time. On the other hand, however, based on carbonate chemistry, when you go from one state and you reduce PCO2 and then increase it back again to the same state, there's actually non-linearities that lead to an increase in pH. So this is actually a fixed ocean acidification mitigation potential that OAE has once you get back to the equilibrated state. But it's rather small, I would say, because of these amounts of alkalinity that we add here. So let me conclude. Is first about the efficiencies. We've seen that the gross ocean capture efficiency is quite constant and close to the maximum efficiency, which is pretty important for carbon crediting. But the actual carbon uptake, or how much carbon is stored in the ocean, so the efficiency there is really much dependent on the global carbon cycle feedbacks. And focusing on ocean acidification, I would say that there's a limited ocean acidification mitigation potential of OAE, and that this really depends on the timescales until the added alkalinity sort of equilibrates again, or the system equilibrates again with the atmosphere, but we still have this net benefit. However, in our simulations, we see that over time, this additional impact of alkalinity enhancement is on very small orders, while we add huge amounts of alkalinity. So to get like proper signals, as Brennan has shown, you would need to scale it up or scale the alkalinity addition to super large scales. And most importantly, we see that the largest OA mitigation really comes from changes in atmospheric CO2, which could be due to any CDR approach, no matter if marine or terrestrial CDR. So I would say, and of course it's known, but I still think it's good to emphasize this, is that the emission reduction is still the most effective measure against ongoing ocean acidification, and CDR can help, but it's not like a saving grace here. Thanks.
Super. Thank you so much, Henrik. Yeah, I think both of the talks really converge on this last point that you make, like imminent reductions are probably what we should be focusing on, or in addition to other strategies. Okay, as planned, we have now 5 minutes for questions. I think that we have 2 questions in the Q&A box, but I don't have access to such box. Maybe someone from the coordination can.
Yeah, I can help out with that. So our first question is from Ana Veronica Garcia Condo. Is there any significant evidence of restorative aquaculture, muscle-based, and OA mitigation? And I believe that this was for Brendan. I think it came in around that time.
I was afraid I might get this question because I'm kind of the wrong person to answer it. I don't have a good, I don't have a comprehensive awareness of that kind of part of the field, but I would say that I think I see some people who are attendees who would have a much better way to answer that. So I might pop the ball over to anyone who wanted to try to answer that in chat.
Yeah, you're all welcome to raise your hand if you want to respond to this, then I'll unmute you. In the meantime, anybody's welcome to do that. We'll move on to our next question from Libby Jewett for Hendrik. For your modeling effort, how much alkalinity would have to be added to the ocean and over what area and frequency to induce the responses that you showed in your models?
Well, in our model simulations, we added 0.14 petamole of alkalinity a year, which is on, and that every year for like 475 years, which is huge. And like a yearly addition, I think, corresponds to like global cement production or like current mining of minerals for general infrastructure industry purposes. So you will need to scale it up immensely to get these effects that we see in our model run. And then also on the same note, I think life cycle emissions of all these processes are super important to actually get a net benefit here of this CDR approach.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that's everything from our Q&A at this time, but feel free, audience members, to keep asking questions of these panelists and our next couple of speakers, and we'll have a few other breaks throughout the session to respond to these questions.
Yes, the next question break will be after the following 2 speakers. Right. For the next talks, I would like to introduce our 3rd speaker, which is Dr. Nina Bednaršek. She's a biological oceanographer specializing in the impact of climate change and MRV, so monitoring, reporting, and verification solutions, on marine organisms and ecosystems. Her work integrates large-scale field-based observations, experimental research, ecosystem modeling with synthesis and meta-analysis to comprehensively understand the effects of multiple environmental stressors, contributing to the development of thresholds for evaluating risk in fisheries and aquaculture industries. The research also focuses on the impacts of ocean alkalinity enhancement, evaluating its ecological and biogeochemical implications, and explores opportunities related to ocean alkalinity enhancement natural analogs. The goal of her work is to develop strategies that enhance ocean resilience while ensuring the sustainability of marine biodiversity and advancing innovative climate solutions. Thank you, Nina. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just share the screen and we can go ahead. All right. Are we in full mode now?
No, I'm afraid, no.
No?
It's dark right now. Oh, here it is. I think it was
Yeah.
just taking a moment to load. We can see your PowerPoint.
Awesome. Oh, okay. I'll be talking about the impact of the ocean alkalinity enhancement on marine calcifiers, biological effect assessment, and also mitigating potential on ocean acidification through the ocean alkalinity enhancement. And this is really, in effect, 2 studies combined in one. So quite a lot to cover. So let's get started. If I can. All right. So from the biological point of view, we already know that negative.
Nina, sorry for interrupting. We are not seeing your slides change. I think that you have to go into presenters mode because we still see the first presentation.
Okay. Is
Introductory.
this the second slide now?
No.
No. No. I'm going forward, so I'm not sure what's going on.
Okay, now they're moving, but we see the second one now, not in presentation mode, but if it works, we can go this way.
I can also share your slides, Nina, and then you can just tell me when to advance.
Okay.
Okay, I have them up, so just let me know when you want to move forward.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Okay, so let's start with the next one, please. All right, so we already know that oceanification has negative biological impacts, and years, actually decades of OA research had given us a detailed understanding of those impacts. We now understand which species can be used as indicators. We also know where the thresholds are and what sort of monitoring strategies to use. So we also understand that there is an urgent need to mitigate OA to manage and preserve vulnerable species, habitats, and this has obviously important socioeconomic implications. Ocean alkalinity enhancement is a potential solution, currently has really the highest potential of them all in terms of mitigating OA, but the ecological consequences are poorly understood at the moment. And in general, the consensus on the bio side should be that it should only be implemented if it's not causing an additional biological harms or risks. Next one, please. So how do we know about the risks that OAE is actually imposing? Studies on biological effects of OAE have begun only recently, so we don't have that much of a data. But what we have so far is that there are quite similar complexities as we have in the OA research. So lots of variability, species-specific responses, and that really actually limits the progress and the rate of the progress that we need, given how quickly the industry is progressing on the OAE. So the question is, in the absence of data, how do we make that progress on assessing and evaluating the risks? We develop monitoring strategies, and we assure that we have those safety limits not exceeded. So really the question is, the OA generated data in the recent decades, predictive patterns and responses, how can we use them to help us in progressing the field of OAE further? Next one, and faster. So our initial study started with extensive literature review and the synthesis. We were reviewing 68 species, 84 species across different 11 functional groups, from corals, coral, algae, mollusks, foraminifera, all of those basically noted in this diagram. This is the study we've published this year already, so take a look at the data if you're interested in this. We were particularly looking at the calcification rates of marine calcifiers, and initially we were skeptical if we will have enough of data on the higher range of the pH, given that these were OA experiments. But it turns out that this was very much a feasible exercise, and we could delineate the OAE context for this. Next one, please. So how we were doing it, we were basically from the previous studies recognizing what sort of different categories of classification responses we could have. So basically distinguishing between linear, exponential, and positive and negative responses, sigmoidal or neutral responses. And what we did then, for each species that we did, we were conceptually adding sodium hydroxide to predict the responses to higher pH that were associated, obviously, with OAE additions. So we were adding sodium hydroxide in the 5 increments of 50 micromole per kilogram, more as a realistic treatments. And we were then also adding much larger increments to try to obtain the threshold values. And then we were basically calculating classification rates and got those regression models. So if you wanted to do something similar for your species of interest in your region, we have the open code published, so use it if you like to. Next one, please. Okay, so the first responses that we got when we were combining all these species together, we found that there is quite a lot of variability between and within different functional groups that we examined. So in general, we'll see, so the prediction based on our models is that we'll see 25% of species having a negative response. And the most sensitive would be echinoderms, coralline algae, dinoflagellates, and crustaceans. But there are also approximately 35% positive responders, such as corals and mollusks. So there is obviously some community shifts going on. We'll have winners, we'll have losers, and maybe some neutral species in between. So as said, these are predictions. We need to test them experimentally and in the field, but this really provides a guidance on the most sensitive species for which we urgently need experimental data, and species with no reason for concern. And maybe those are less of a priority for the research right now. Next one, please. Okay, and so the higher additions of alkalinity then help us derive the threshold as well. And we were expecting it that the species threshold, so the threshold as a value beyond which negative response are basically recorded, would be at much higher additions. But those started to occur somewhere in the range of 200 to 500 micromole per kilogram of sodium hydroxide. And then synthesizing most recent data from the literature, this threshold value is somehow in agreement with a lot of different studies that are showing some sort of negative responses, and also what we have found this summer when we were working on the Dungeness crab and krill as well. So anyway, these thresholds, we have done studies like this for the OA thresholds before, are extremely useful tool for the application in the models and observations, and they really are great to determine potential biological safety limits, determine which are the most sensitive species indicators, monitoring, and they can be really used regionally across different temporal and spatial scales. So this is kind of the way forward how we are envisioning going with biology. Next one, please. All right, so this is now the other aspect of this talk, is how we talk about the mitigating effect of ocean acidification. So anecdotally, we have really heard so much about how the OAE can offer a co-benefit by temporarily mitigating the negative effects of OA on marine biota. But really, to what extent, right? I mean, chemically, it's one thing, but how do we find that biological impacts? And so we have taken part of the study that we have done and only focus on marine calcifying species from the previous study that has showed a decline in calcification under OA. And so those species were then expected to benefit from ocean alkalinity enhancement. And so what we wanted to do in parallel, first step would be to evaluate the calcification decline attributable to ocean acidification, and then try to quantify so-called responsiveness to OAE by calculating the change in calcification and mitigation time after the addition of sodium hydroxide. Next one, please. All right, so this is a little bit loaded here, and if you have more questions, I'm keen to give you more of a detailed explanation further. But how we've done this, so we were really looking to evaluate biological and chemical implications of TA additions. Those were species-specific calcification increases at the addition of 50 micromole per kilogram of sodium hydroxide, and we have done it in the unequilibrated and equilibrated way. And then we were also calculating the OAE mitigation time, so-called temporal recovery from OA for a given treatment of OAE. For that, we've used global monthly time series reconstruction of the surface-only ocean chemistry for the past 40 years using ocean soda model, to which we have continuously been adding TA at different treatments of 110 and 100 micromole per kilogram. And we've chosen these concentrations really because we wanted to have a more realistic treatments in there. We didn't want to go for something extreme that will never happen in a natural environment. Mitigation time we've calculated for this formula in here, but know that, for example, if we're talking about delta TA of 100 corresponding to a mitigation time of, let's say, 10 years, this indicates that the addition of TA gets to the conditions that were present under the unperturbed conditions 10 years earlier. So that's a logic. Next one, please. Okay, so first, obviously, talking about the calcification rates since the pre-industrial times, we have found very species-specific decline to ocean acidification, and so-called linear calcification responders show much larger reduction in calcification from 7 to 44%, and that decline was most pronounced in gastropods, pteropods, and corals. But equally, that slope of calcification determined their responsiveness to OAE. And we have seen increase in calcification from 2 to 52%, and linear responders benefiting more than exponential responders. So basically, the more a species loses because of the OA, the more it can benefit due to OAE. Next one, please. And then we were also looking at the mitigation time. And here you can see basically different TA of 1, 10, 50, and 100, and different concentrations differently contribute to elevated pH. And there is a continued decline, obviously, because of the continued CO2 uptake. And this data are kind of similar to what Hendrik was previously showing us. Here I want just to show that the additions we work with led to a pH mitigation time of some 3, 14, and 27 years. It's important to note that if you wanted to have any mitigation time shift for more than a few years only, the TA must be, so the addition of TA must be higher than 10 micromole per kilogram. So that's a relatively short time of mitigation, given how much effort we are actually putting into the ocean with the addition of alkalinity. Next one, please. And this is really the most comprehensive, and I think probably the most content to discuss. So the fact is that the more efficient the CO2 uptake is, or we're talking about so-called CDR, higher CDR efficiency, the less effective OA mitigation of the chemical and biological impacts is. I think it's really essential to recognize that biological restoration will not go hand in hand with the climate mitigation. And this does possess a challenge for implementing OAE to actually realize these biological co-benefits for OA mitigation, because it's obviously we cannot talk about co-benefits while on one hand we have OAE, which is not benefiting the OA at all. So how do we work in this kind of space solutions? I think it's really important that we start prioritizing which habitats and which species we wanted to implement, what sort of mitigation times are feasible, are really important. For example, we could talk about severely impacted species, vulnerable, endangered habitats, or nursing grounds for economically and ecologically important species would probably profit short-term from OAE. But maybe this is not something that we will be thinking over longer term and over larger regional or global scales at all. So a little bit food for thought. This is not yet a published study, but we have it in revisions right now. So thanks so much for this.
Super. Thank you so much, Nina, for this talk. It was really interesting. Okay, we'll continue with our next speaker. And in the meantime, you can already write your questions for Nina in the question and answers box. And we can also have some time for questions after Lina. Lina Hansson is our next speaker. She holds a Master's of Science in Biotechnology Engineering from the University of Lund in Sweden, and has more than 15 years experience in managing scientific projects and initiatives in an international and multicultural environment. She leads the IAEA's Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center, which is based at the IAEA Marine Environmental Laboratories in Monaco. She is the co-secretary of the Ocean Acidification and Other Ocean Changes, Impacts and Solution, OASIS initiative, led by the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation. Lina, the floor is yours.
Oh, Lena, I'm not hearing you at the moment.
Now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good.
Sorry about that. Let me see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's perfect.
All right. Now I was saying thank you, Anna, and I was also saying that the acronym is even worse in French to pronounce, so it's completely understandable. I know the feeling. So thank you again. Hello, everyone. Before getting started, I just wanted to give you a heads up that my talk is divided into two parts. So first, I will talk to some early coordination and capacity building efforts on mCDR, and more specifically on OAE, and how we can build on some of the resources and coordination developed on ocean acidification during the past 15 years or so. And then if there is time, I will conclude by quickly showing a few early lab results from on OAE impacts done at the IEA labs in Monaco by my colleagues Sam Dupont and Marc Métian and others. So if there is time, it should be quick anyway. So just a word first about the OACC and what we do. So the labs here in Monaco are hosting since 2012 the Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center, so the OAICC. Our mission is to support and empower IEA member states to study and address ocean acidification and promote and facilitate international collaboration in this field. And we focus on three key areas that you will see here on the screen. First, we try to help advance at least ocean acidification science, supporting GOA-ON, of course, and its regional hubs. We promote the development of best practices and also simplified methodology to make sure that the OA field is accessible and inclusive. And we also maintain a number of resources and provide access to a number of resources, such as a bibliographic database and data portals on the biological response to ocean acidification. Second, we have a large effort on capacity building, so helping to train tomorrow's experts on ocean acidification and multiple stressors as well. And then we're also focusing on communicating and elevating the message on ocean acidification at different fora, such as UNFCCC COPs and other events. So here we go. So importantly, and what I should have said on the other slide is that we obviously work with many partners to do that, including IUC UNESCO, the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, and many others. And we are also, in addition to looking into ocean acidification, more recently looking into ocean-based solutions and particularly ocean alkalinity enhancement. So as international research on mCDR is really taking off, there are some parallels and insights that we can draw from, again, about 15 years or so of global coordination and efforts and international collaboration on ocean acidification. And there is a wealth of information and resources that can be useful as the mCDR field develops. So over the OA community has been very successful in coordinating and collaborating at the international level and also across disciplines. And the community, as we know, rapidly came together to form GOA-ON and structured itself into its regional hubs that were mentioned earlier, and to really support local and regional science and policy and action on ocean acidification. And this might be a model that the mCDR community also would like to adopt to ensure ownership and inclusivity. And GOA-ON has a specific working group, which is looking into how ocean acidification data and resources can support mCDR research. This group is led by Helen Finley, and there is a really good paper that she published with others from the group earlier this year in oceanography. Beyond science, the OA community has also been actively engaging with a broader audience through, for example, the UN Decade Program, OARS, Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability. And that is also especially important for mCDR. The OA community has developed a number of resources, some of them that you will see here on the screen, such as news outlets, databases, and best practices to ensure that results and data are accessible and comparable. So there is, again, a wealth of knowledge and data that can guide and inspire mCDR research that we just saw from Nina's talk as well. For example, data on how marine organisms respond to changes in seawater chemistry can be used to identify species to focus on, for example, for mCDR. And there are already some of the resources that that were shown on the other slide have inspired, let's say, similar resources on CDR. For example, this new stream, which is really helpful, which I think all know about, provided by the German project CDR Terra and CDR Mare, which is a news stream publishing all new publications on CDR, both terrestrial and marine. There has been a development of a guide to best practices in ocean alkalinity enhancement research, led by Andreas Oschlies and Jean-Pierre Gattuso. And there are 13 chapters. Many authors came together to do this guide with recommendations on various aspects on OAE research, from chemistry to biology, modeling, data management, but also societal and legal implications. So that's a great resource as well. And then there are other recent efforts, for example, data management efforts and protocols from the Carbon to Sea initiative, for example, and there are other efforts as well from Ocean Visions and other groups active in this space. And also in terms of capacity building, so there has been a very large effort from many partners trying to make OA build capacity on OA globally and trying to foster an inclusive, research community. So more than 1,000 scientists from 100 countries have been trained to date by various actors in this space. And we are also trying to come together to work together and to coordinate our own efforts and to evaluate the success of that program. So there are many lessons learned to be taken from that also to inspire capacity building from mCDR. And I just wanted to mention one training or recent effort, or the very first training that we did at the IEA in April this year. We organized together with the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation a training on the biological impacts of OAE, and the course was based on the best practices guide, and especially chapter 4, which is on experimental design. So we had 10 early career scientists from as many countries involved in this course, and lecturers, a number of lecturers, including Fabrice Pernet from Ifremer, Sam Dupont, and Marc Métian from the IEA, and also lecturers from the labs, oceanographic labs in Villefranche-sur-Mer. And while the focus of this course was really on the biological impacts, as I said, through lab experiments, we also had guest lectures on other chapters of the guide, which was very much appreciated by the students. So during the course, the participants were introduced to various approaches, first to produce alkalinity in seawater and designing lab experiments to test the impacts of high alkalinity and also toxic metals that may be released from the source of alkalinity. And then we did some experiments in the lab testing increased alkalinity on the impact on the fertilization of sea urchin larvae. So we plan a second edition of this training course in April next year in Monaco. So if there is interest, if you know someone who would be interested, don't hesitate to reach out. So just to summarize this part, there is a lot to build on and capitalize on, let's say, from more than 15 years of global coordination on ocean acidification. OA science, of course, can inform the mCDR research agenda by the wealth of data and results which are available, models as well. There are a number of resources that are helpful as well, and it may be useful to develop networks similarly to we have done for GOA-ON with regional hubs approach and capacity building to foster this inclusive research community. What was really helpful, which I didn't mention in the talk, but which was helpful to bring the community together, was the Ocean in a High CO2 World Conference series. And there is one coming up next year, as you may know already, in Wellington in New Zealand. So we expect that there will be a lot of discussion and sessions focused on mCDR during that meeting as well. But yes, mCDR is more complex than OA, so there is a need for more, very responsible, transparent, and inclusive research and open access data sharing, communication and co-design of efforts from the very beginning. So will also be crucial moving forward. So that was the part on the lessons learned, let's say, from the OA community in general. And then, as I said, if I have a few minutes, otherwise shout on me, Anna, but it will take 1 minute to introduce you what my colleagues have done in the lab at the IEA. So they just tested early responses, or did some early testing on responses of the sea urchin that you can see here, Paracentrales lividus. And this graph shows the larvae submitted to different alkalinity tested. And what they saw was actually no negative effect on the growth rate or the calcification rate with increasing alkalinity. But then they also checked mortality. And there they saw a very strong effect, actually, of increased mortality under both low and elevated alkalinity, suggesting that this species may be adapted to quite a narrow range of alkalinity, and that it may suffer from an increasing TA as Nina also indicated in her talk. And then they also did some tests on corals and on calcification, where there was a significant increase, also touched on by Nina, with increasing TA, so no negative effect there. I don't have time to go much into this, I think, but there is an pH effect due to the alkalinity. So if you plot only the pH, you can see that there is a nice response. Obviously, what they did not do yet is looking at other parameters such as mortality. So as we saw for the sea urchins, it's not because there is no effect on, or a positive effect even on calcification, that there is no effect on other parameters and fitness in general, of course. So I quit here. I think I might be over time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lina. Now we are just on time, I believe.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, now we'll start with the mini Q&A session that Carly will coordinate.
Yeah, great. We have like maybe time for one question before we move on to our final speaker. And we just got a new question in the chat from Chandrasekhara Sarma. It's been inspiring to hear such diverse perspectives on mCDR, from OAE's potential to buffer ocean acidification to the variability of capture efficiency across regions and scenarios, the biological thresholds for calcifiers, and the importance of early coordination and capacity building. Looking ahead, how do you see the future of OAE evolving alongside natural sequestration pathways, such as mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes? What scientific, ecological, and governance challenges must be addressed to weave these approaches into a coherent, finance-ready ocean climate strategy? So I think this touches on a few of our speakers, but I'll give Lina the first opportunity to answer this.
You said Nina, right? And not Lina.
Oh, Lina. Sorry. You can go ahead, Lina.
No, I thought that it might be Nina. You might have a better
Nina can also,
reply to this than I have. But I guess that as I think that we obviously there are different. As was said previously, this is not a solution, so to speak. So in terms of climate mitigation, I guess we need to pursue different options, and especially research, so that we, as also mentioned by Nina and others, we don't know, for example, so much about the ecological impacts yet about OAE. So while some of the other things that you mentioned, natural sequestration pathways, are more like win-win or like no risk solutions in a way, but they are not going to have such much impact on climate in the end. So I don't know, I guess it's a big mix of different avenues, and especially reducing CO2 emissions, that was also mentioned by our first two speakers in the end. But Nina, you must have more to say about this.
So if I understand, the question is really how to, here it is, yes, how to maybe combine blue carbon with OAE.
Yes, I believe so. How are these evolving together?
Yeah, I think we don't have a lot of knowledge for how the blue carbon and alkalinity combines, right? And in essence, they could be very well together, but I think they would have to be spatially actually separated, because enhancement of the carbon in the blue carbon system, especially at the roots level, actually increases calcification and the sequestration. Specifically, when we are talking about the inorganic carbon, well, that can actually have a negative effect on the ocean alkalinity enhancement. So I think when it comes to carbonate precipitation, we will have to be careful how not to combine it too closely, because then in order not to make OAE less efficient. But I think also that the blue carbon and OAE and variety of different hybrid solutions could go hand in hand, and maybe across different spatial and temporal scales. So I think what we don't have so far is the knowledge of how, for example, scaling up OAE would negatively impact or would impact blue carbon in general. Where are those thresholds where we could have a net benefit or net loss, for example? So in the interaction of the blue carbon and OAE, lots more needs to be happening from the scientific perspective. I think from the ecological perspective, we really lack the knowledge on the thresholds, and maybe for some of the more sensitive, especially ecologically and economically important classifiers, those thresholds are lower. So it's really important to determine when and how we should be implementing OAE in order not to cross the thresholds. And from the governance challenge, this is all encompassing. It's really how the ecological benefits should be scaling up along with the attribution effects and the carbon credits. And this is really complex, and maybe not my particular forte in this particular discussion, but it's not straightforward. I think this really shows us how intertwined and transdisciplinary the mCDR field is. I think that's really important for the early career scientists as well, to understand that this is not one field. It's really all from the natural science to the social science connection happening. And what this question relates to is the sheer interdisciplinarity and complexity of the topics that mCDR tackles.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer, Nina. I'll pass it back to Anna to introduce our final speaker.
Yes, thank you, Carly. And thank you, Nina and Nina, for your response. That it's actually an excellent segue for the last segment of the session, which will be led by Patrick Duke, who I will introduce now, our last speaker. Patrick Duke is the head of field work at Carbon Run, where he leads measurement and monitoring of Carbon Run's river alkalinity enhancement approach for carbon dioxide removal. As a highly motivated climate scientist with expertise in ocean science and carbon monitoring, Patrick is interested in mitigating climate impacts through scalable emission reductions and durable carbon dioxide removal. Collaborative community-driven projects and nature and equity-focused initiatives. He is also a sustainability leader in his community, focused on training people to combat climate change through art, policy, and innovation. Specifically, he'll talk us and lead us into a community discussion on early career recommendations for the equitable growth of a marine carbon dioxide removal sector. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks for the introduction, Anna. Can you guys see my screen? Okay, is that working?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. So this is going to be a little bit less technical than the last couple of talks we've had. Lena, I'm glad you went ahead of me, and we kind of introduced capacity building and the skill set that we in this community have, and I think hopefully can apply in a very positive way to marine carbon dioxide removal. So my background is in ocean acidification, just like many of you on the call. I see lots of former colleagues and collaborators and people I've crossed paths with throughout my career, thinking about making high quality measurements of the carbonate system in coastal oceans, open ocean, thinking about how the system interacts with ecosystems. I think if you guys take anything away from this talk, I'll try to keep it on time. It's that you have a very unique skill set, and the world is asking for you to use it in a very applied way right now to keep this entire industry that is still in an infancy, keep it accountable and not fall to some of the things that have made previous iterations of carbon dioxide removal and carbon offsetting markets really lack transparency and really lack the public trust and degrade public trust in the way that it was operating. So hopefully that's the biggest takeaway. But I think it was alluded to a couple times. Just quick, we need to reach this sort of -20, -10 gigatons per year to meet our sort of global climate goals. How we do that, there's a number of different ways to do that. I think today everybody focused a lot on ocean alkalinity enhancement, but there are a whole swath of companies out there practicing a whole bunch of different approaches to CDR, both oceanside, terrestrial, thinking about direct air capture on land as well. But all of these companies are all sort of playing by the same rules in this emerging sort of durable carbon market. And it's this iteration of it. And when you just take a snapshot of sort of who's out there, this is from CDR.FYI. I'm not sure how familiar everybody here is with this website, but it's a tracking tool that is essentially used to track sales and delivery of carbon credits. You can see the sort of top suppliers, you can see the sort of top buyers. This was a snapshot from today. I mean, some of these numbers, if you haven't seen them, should definitely jump out. I mean, total spent by some of these buyers towards getting durable carbon credits, $10 billion, total tons of CO2 being sold, north of 38 million. And then the total number of purchases delivered, I mean, pretty shockingly low, 2.5%. I know there's a couple other suppliers on this call too, and I wonder if they're optimistic or pessimistic about some of these numbers. But I mean, this is still emerging, but there is a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of money moving around in this space right now. Where this sort of takes us is before I even got into this sort of for-profit role, when I was still in sort of working in ocean acidification during my PhD, along with a bunch of collaborators and colleagues, and I think Mallory, Kalina, Jakob, you're all on this call, so feel free to answer some questions as we go forward as well. But we were thinking about, what do we want sort of out of this emerging sector as it is growing from an early career perspective to help keep it accountable? And I think there's two sort of big sort of categories that we were able to pull out of. So across approaches in mCDR as a whole, I know we talked a lot about ocean alkalinity enhancement, but across these other approaches, sort of the two biggest pieces that we pulled from this paper were one, global equity, and two, capacity building. And we'll try to touch on a couple of different points inside each of these. The first one for global equity, I mean, observations and the availability of scientific knowledge and critical, high quality scientific observations of the carbonate system, the ecosystem responses, ocean acidification trends in every area of the ocean that some of these mCDR companies are operating. And we are quick to see, this is just a snapshot from one of our colleagues, also in our sort of our early career group, Jacqueline. She published this last year at the EGU blogs about just the distribution of SOCAT observations. And I mean, these are surface ocean PCO2 observations, but I think they give you a good indication of maybe where the rest of water quality measurements are, ecosystem measurements, thresholds, biological understanding, and then how all those things fit together, and the sort of the very stark distribution between more economically developed regions in the world and their coastlines, and then sort of less economically developed regions in the world, and the access to that baselining data that is really being used to help subtract from the interventions that could be taking place in the mCDR community as some of these pilot projects build out, as some of these at-scale projects build out. So that sort of is pretty stark, and that access is something that we all, I think, are working towards or thinking about making improvements in to improve this access and expanding sort of the global equity around these observations. The next piece is around joint learning opportunities. Carbon to Sea is sort of a big group out there that is helping facilitate a lot of these to help build public trust across a number of different components of the mCDR project development sort of process. So both from feedstock to MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, but also on the regulatory side, and then on the community engagement side. So I think some of these newer JLOs that Carbon2C is getting out are going to include that sort of breadth, which is really encouraging, especially in regions where a lot of that regulatory environment isn't quite built out in the same way. I'm thinking about those economically developing regions in the world where, a couple big projects in the US that were quite public about the way that their permitting process was taking place. I mean, that same enthusiasm from the community to ensure that things are proceeding in an appropriate way, that regulatory environment and those sort of checks maybe don't exist in other places. So it's going to take these more international spotlights and a collection of researchers like yourselves to work together to help improve those situations, because not only are we thinking about impacts on the ground with biological responses and ensuring efficient uptake, but also real impacts to communities and how it's received in those areas where these projects are being built out. Another sort of check on that in this sort of trust infrastructure space is registries. They play a pretty important role. So I'm just highlighting one example here. This is Carbon Run. The registry is isometric. These protocols for how each of these approaches actually go from adding feedstock to doing their MRV, to quantifying uptake, to subtracting all of the emissions that are emitted in the process, to then delivering that to a customer through this registry. All of those protocols exist online. They're all, open for public comments. And I would be curious to hear from other supply side folks. As far as I know, the river alkalinity enhancement piece on isometric, it didn't get a lot of comments. I mean, there was a handful, but it's definitely not getting the attention that it deserves. Like I said, these are international standards. So it's going beyond those sort of regulatory frameworks that are built out in some places and aren't in others. And it goes even deeper. So inside the registry, beyond the protocol, you can see individual projects and you can make comments there as well. So, thinking about the community engagement side of it also on top of the MRV. The last piece here is just about the capacity building and demand in this sector to grow. You saw the 10 billion investment, direct purchases from customers. I mean, Microsoft being the top one. In order to meet that need, it's going to take a lot of skilled people across a range of disciplines. But this discipline and people on this call are particularly important. The ocean acidification lens that you have, the way you think critically about measuring the carbonate system, the way you think critically about how the knock-on effects can change ecosystems. I mean, all of that is absolutely crucial, and applying it through JLOs or through, actually, if your early career, direct involvement in companies, or at least in the infrastructure that is being built out across the sector. So here's a snapshot of the market map. I know this is pretty daunting, but there's a lot more than just customer and supplier. I mean, there's a ton of, auditors, life cycle assessment people, digital platforms, investors take a pretty hard look at what you're doing on each of these projects and each of these approaches before moving forward. But then, NGOs and groups like that are acting as watchdogs. I think one of the big maybe gaps in this market map is still the public scrutiny that I don't think we've received yet from journalists and so on. But there's a lot of different companies on this market map from Puro, which is another registry that you could get involved in some capacity, especially if you're just looking to graduate and you're looking to apply your knowledge in an application-based way to help make sure that this sector is built out in a way that we all have some trust in. Just highlighting the supply side, there's a handful of companies. They're each broken down by sort of what they do. There's a master list that I'm happy to add as well to the chat here. I just found this today on LinkedIn, actually. somebody was able to put together. This is a snapshot of sort of all of the mCDR suppliers in the space, where they're located, what sort of approach they use, and a link to their website. And most of these suppliers will have links to a protocol on a registry, or we'll be building it out and we'll be looking for public comment. So this sort of trust infrastructure, which is sort of the word that keeps reoccurring in webinars in our space, absolutely critical, but it really takes people to make sure that it is working and operating appropriately. So maybe I'll leave it there. And I know maybe going over as we're kind of coming to the end. But this is just what we want to avoid. I think like people, this should be top of memory for most. I mean, these were the Guardian articles about reforestation, afforestation a couple of years ago. This was right around when I was graduating. And this is really what motivated me to get into the space, to avoid this. I mean, I want to be part of a durable carbon market that is held accountable and is real and is transparent with communities and is working closely with collaborating with them. And I think, you know, we all have a role to play in this and avoiding something like this. And especially with, you know, AI data centers and the demand for carbon credits only going up, I think it's really important to highlight. So a less technical talk, maybe a call to action. I'm happy to get into a discussion after this too.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I am afraid that we are running out of time and we will not have time for questions in this topic. I would encourage everyone with questions for Patrick to please get in touch with him and with the team of mCDR that GOA-ON hosts. I will conclude the session by saying thank you to all the speakers. We would now finish and pass it on to Carly.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone. This has been a wonderful session. And thanks for sticking with us. I know we're a couple of minutes over time. But we would just love to thank all of our organizers, the moderators. Anna, you've been a wonderful moderator for the event and just pulling it all together. And thank you to our speakers who made this such an amazing session. Oh, that was a cat, sorry. And we would also like to thank you, our audience, for joining us at OA Week 2025. Please don't forget to consult the website and register for any other sessions that may interest you. Please be in touch with the Secretariat. That's secretariat@goaon.org. If you'd like to get in touch with any of our speakers today to continue this conversation. And if you'd like to stay up to date with the GOA-ON community, consider signing up as a GOA-ON member. You can use the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen. And thank you all so much for your participation today, and we will see you next time.